We are reviewing another topic in this video. This is the object class of Java. The object class is the root class, is the superclass of all classes in Java, classes and interfaces. Everything is of type object except primitive types. So if you declare a reference any object of type object, it can hold the reference of any type. For example, if you have a student class and you create a student object, any object can store its address. If you have an integer object, any object can store its address. If you have a string object, any object can store its address, and so on. Let's now talk about one important method in the class object, that is the equals method. When you compare two objects in Java, you should not use the two equal symbols, the equals. That is good only for comparing primitive types like integers or booleans or characters. But when you are comparing strings or books or students or faculty or anything else, any object, you should usually use the equals method. For example, if you want to compare if two books are equal, you should compare the two books using the equals method. The idea is that every class, like a book or a student or anything else, would have an override of the equals method, and that method will decide when two objects of this class are equal. So there are some things to be considered while using the equals method, while implementing the equals method. So when you have a book class, you should not write the equals method so that the book is equal to a string. For example, if ID is a string, that is the case here, you should not be able to compare like this. This should not return true, because book is a book object, ID is a string object. You can't never say that a string is equal to a book. Either this way, is book one equal to ID, or is ID equal to book one? Neither one of these should print true. In fact, when you code the equals method in Java for any class, ensure that it follows certain requirements. For example, if x is compared against x equal to, through the equals method, it should return true. If x is equal to y, and then y should be equal to x. X dot equals y should return true if and only if y dot equals returns true. And if x dot y is true and y dot equals x dot equals y is true and y dot equals z is true, then x dot equals z should return true. This is the transitivity rule. This is the symmetry. This is the property of symmetry. And this, when you have this property, we say that the relation is reflexive. So equals should be satisfying all these. Any relationship that satisfies all these conditions is called an equivalence relation. You may recall that from discrete math. So equals is an equivalence relation. You cannot code the method willy-nilly, right? There are more restrictions. there is another method in the object class called hashcode. If you have two objects equal by the equals method, then the hash code on those two objects should also produce the same integer values. And when you have two objects, x and y, x dot equals y should be consistent. Repeated calls of this should always return the same value. Assuming, of course, that you haven't modified x or y. And x dot equals null should return false. So when you code your equals method, ensure that all these conditions are satisfied. One way of ensuring that is to use the Eclipse IDE. You can use the source menu to generate the hash code and the equals method. But when you do that, ensure that you are only comparing fields that you want. It will actually give you the option, an option to say which fields should be chosen. So if you try it out, you will see which fields should be used for comparison. You should pick those. And also for coding conventions, ensure that all the if statements are in blocks, that you don't have incomplete words as variables for variable names, etc. Eclipse doesn't take care of some of those things. So this would be one way of coding the equals method for a student class. For example, if you want to compare whether a given object is equal to a student object, you first check if the parameter to the equals method, it is always of type object. If it is equal to null, then the student object cannot be equal to that. And the return type is, of course, Boolean, return false. And this is checking whether the object is of type student. If the object is of type student, then this will return true. And if it is not of type student, then we return false. Otherwise, we cast this as a student object and we check whether the name of the student is equal to the name of this object, and whether the address of the incoming student is equal to the address of this object. That is what I decided should be the consideration for checking whether one student is equal to another. You could have a different interpretation of the equals method, a different way of implementing the equals method. This is entirely up to the designer of the class. The other important object methods are toString and clone. We have already discussed toString in a previous video. Clone, we probably won't spend much time this semester. It is, in my opinion, a little less important for the kind of things we are doing here.